Okay, well, I think most of the participants we were expecting to join us have now joined this webinar. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, my name is Phil Daniels. I'm the Executive Vice President here at Brand Asset Management Group. And I want to thank you for taking the time to join us for this webinar today. The topic is business succession planning basics, or business continuation, if you will. And, we're privileged to have a wonderful speaker today in the name Brian Seigel, who is an attorney, though not a practicing attorney, I guess, is his primary vocation. But Brian is the Director of Advanced Planning at BUI, and has been a really good friend to our firm and has helped a number of our clients with some advanced planning strategies and business planning specifically. And so we were thinking about an issue that we think is really important for business owner clients. And we thought, you know what, Brian is the best resource we know to hit on this. And it really is the succession planning element. And as Brian goes through his presentation today, you're going to see that there are really two different types of planning that needs to be done. One is for an anticipated exit from the business, and the other would be an unexpected exit from the business. The reason we at Brand think this is important is because we do recognize just how critically important the business ownership is to a family's overall financial picture in most cases. And so if there is a vulnerability or a failure to plan in an element of the business that could jeopardize that family's financial plan, we definitely want to make sure that we're a voice of counsel and helping to bring that issue to light so it can be addressed appropriately. As I mentioned, Brian is with BUI, and he, in addition to providing business succession planning advice to business owners, he's also very well versed in other areas of estate planning and tax planning and retirement planning, and he really is a phenomenal friend here to the firm. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Brian. Before I do that, one quick thing, we're anticipating that this webinar is going to run 45 to 60 minutes. We do want to be respectful of your time here today. As we go through the presentation, if you have additional questions, please use the Q&A feature in Zoom to submit a question, and we'll do our best to answer that. We'll probably hold most of the questions for the end, but if we see a question that's relevant to what we're talking about right at the moment, we'll try to address it at that point. So again, thank you for joining us, and Brian, take it away.
Thank you, Phil, and good morning, everyone. First of all, a little bit more on my background and why I do work with business owners and how I work with business owners. So ultimately, our company, BUI, formerly Brokerage Unlimited, is the parent company of First Element Insurance Planners. And we are an insurance brokerage company, but we have a planning side of our business, and that's where my role comes in. I am a former private practice estate planning and business planning and tax planning attorney. And now I am no longer drafting documents for clients. Instead, I'm serving more as a consultant to help identify and address needs as it relates to planning on the business side and on the estate planning side. So that's my role, and more as a consultant. And today we are going to talk about business continuation, succession planning, and as Phil said, really the two essential elements to the ultimate business succession plan. Now, that said, when we talk about succession planning, I always like to start with what it is, and everyone usually identifies the fact, okay, it's who the business is going to be turned over to if you want to get out of the business or have to get out of the business. And that's part of it. But to me, the most important part is also identifying who the appropriate leaders of the business will be. So it's one thing to own the business. It's a whole nother thing to successfully lead the business and ensure that it's going to continue with a high level of success with any successive owners. Now, it's usually upon certain triggering events, and this is the unexpected side, of course, in the event of a death, disability, retirement, disagreement, if there are multiple owners who aren't agreeing and one wants to get out. Involuntary transfer, and that's one that people commonly forget about, which is if a business owner's interest would be subject to a bankruptcy court or would be subject to potentially being distributed as part of a divorce settlement or divorce order in the court, then making sure that the business interest is not going to end up in the hands of the bankruptcy trustee or a divorcing spouse. And it's an incredibly important thing to plan for, yet according to a study conducted in 2016, businesses with fewer than 300 employees aren't planning as you would expect for them to. 60% don't have a plan in place. And these numbers, they're 5 years old and they still stand to be true. So, these just tend not to change over time. But what's interesting to me is the top reasons that were given for failure to plan in this study. First and foremost is it's not necessary. 47% said that. And I think that most business owners are thinking, okay, I'm not interested in getting out now, so I don't need to start the planning process just yet. But as we'll talk about, that is not necessarily the case. And I think it's important to plan no matter what. And again, we'll explore that more as we talk about both sides of a succession plan. Not wanting to give up life's work, and recognizing that business owners do build a business over time. Some of you may have spent more time in your business than with your own children. That's sort of the nature of building a business. And so it is your baby to a great extent, not wanting to give it up. That's a natural reaction. Not knowing when to create a plan. And I think this is on the advisors to make sure that clients are aware of when the appropriate time to create a plan would be and to start the planning process. And then not having time to develop a plan, certainly recognizing that every business owner is extremely busy operating the business on a day-to-day basis, that having the time can be hard to find sometimes. But the problem is that a failure to plan can lead to the failure of the business. And specifically, if you look at a study that was conducted, again, a few years ago, but the numbers still play out to be true each and every study that we see that comes out. But an estimated 30% of family-owned businesses survive to the second generation. And you can see what happens at each successive generation. 12% to the third generation, 3% to the fourth generation and beyond. And I'm always shocked when I am sitting down with an advisor and a business owner client, and they're in the fourth generation or fifth generation. I know that I'm talking to the rare individual who was able to, the family that was able to continue that business on. But also recognizing that not every business is going to be in a position where family members are going to take over. But exploring the two sides of a succession plan, it really boils down to, number one, what I refer to as the planned exit, and number two, the unplanned exit. Sounds pretty simple, right? Well, let's explore these. So first, we've got the voluntary exit, the planned exit. And this is in a situation where you are operating your business and reaching the point where you're saying, okay, I'm getting ready to retire, or I'm getting ready to want to sell the business or transition it to the next generation, potentially if it's going to be a family-owned transition. And ultimately being alive and well, being in a position to be able to negotiate the terms of a purchase, being able to accept and decline offers, being there to fully address the transition of the business and doing it in a meaningful way when you have all the knowledge of the market that's available. And it really is essential to plan ahead of time, as we'll see, to make sure that the business is going to maximize value, number one. Number two, most important, is meeting your objectives. But on the other side is the unforeseen event. So this is a plan that every single business should have in place. And in a perfect world, to me, any business, once it's formed, should immediately have this unplanned exit plan in place. And that is to plan for the unknown. If there was a death, if there was a disability, then what happens with the business interest? And the difficult part about it is you're dealing with the unknown. You don't know what's going to happen. And in the end, if this type of planning is not in place, then ultimately it could put your family in a difficult position where they have to negotiate the sale of the business. And it's an inopportune time to do that if you're active in the business and play a significant role. Well, is the business still going to be able to function at the same high level without your involvement? And in the end, that could mean that the family has to accept an offer that would otherwise be considered unwise to accept. So again, having a full plan in place here to make sure that if, God forbid, something happened, then there's a transition plan to take care of the business interests so that the family isn't left in that position. So what are some of the frequent considerations in planning for succession? Well, these are in no special order because frankly, the motivations are different for every single business and truthfully for every single business owner. Taxes can play a major role. And some of you may be aware that there is pending legislation right now to potentially eliminate stepped up basis at death, right? Right now, if you own a business and you've got, let's just say, a $100,000 basis in a business and it's worth $1 million today. Well, of course, if you sell it during lifetime, there will be capital gains taxes that have to be paid. And it's an oversimplification, but let's assume that it's all capital gain and $900,000 is subject to capital gains. Well, instead, if you hold an interest in a business until death, then your heirs would get a stepped up basis on the business interest. And so if they turn around and sell it the day after you pass, then the step up is up to $1 million in my example. So if they turn around and sell it for $1 million, there's no capital gains tax that would have to be paid. Well, the legislation that's pending right now in the U.S. Senate would actually not only eliminate stepped up basis, they would allow stepped up basis up to $1 million of assets, but anything over and above that would actually be subject to tax at death. Do we expect for this legislation to pass in its current form? No, and I'm not sure that it's got enough traction anyway because of business owners and farmers complaining that this could actually be catastrophic to our businesses when they transfer on to the next generation. So it's something that I'm not overly concerned with, but you know, taxes are a moving target and it's something that always has to be addressed within any kind of transition plan. Risk. So there are lots of risks, whether it is taxes, whether it's not maximizing value, whether it is failure of the business. There's always risk involved. And so to the extent that that risk can be minimized is usually an objective. Keeping options open. And when you have a plan in place, you have the ability to consider all options ahead of time while things are good, while you've got plenty of time to plan, and ultimately, in the end, it's going to lead to a better outcome. Retaining control to the extent that you want, and that may be keeping control during lifetime. It may be making sure that control stays with the right people in the event that you're no longer around to operate the business. And then last but certainly not least is maximizing the value of the business and making sure that no matter what, whether it's a lifetime transition or whether it's a transition that would ultimately happen in the event of a death, that the value of the business is going to be maximized. So a good succession plan is ultimately going to do a couple of things. The one that I usually hear from business owners is, yeah, you know, here are my objectives for the business and I want to make sure that my family is taken care of. But a good succession plan is also going to meet the needs of the other important people involved in the business. That is co-owners, that is key employees, non-key employees, making sure that all involved are going to be put in a position where there's the best opportunity for success. And so involving those individuals, family members, co-owners, and also, of course, key individuals is important. It's an important part of the transition plan because you think about it specifically key employees. Well, are they going to want to stick around if, God forbid, something would happen to you Or are they going to panic and say, oh my gosh, the owner and leader of this business is no longer around. What's going to happen? A lot of uncertainty. And as opposed to that, if they know what the plan is and they have an opportunity to understand the plan that's in place and even be a part of implementing the plan, then they're a whole lot more likely to stick around. And at the same time, the business is a lot more likely to continue on at a high successful level. So again, involving all those parties to the extent that you're comfortable is certainly an important thing. So let's explore the planned exit in some additional detail. The common objectives for business owners that I hear, it really boils down to a couple of key elements. And I'm going to say sort of this umbrella objective, which is having a smooth transition, which is so important for the buyer first and foremost, or buyers. And I think that's, of course, because they want a smooth transition to make sure that the business is not going to be interrupted. They're going to be able to keep customers around. They're going to be able to keep employees around, and at the same time, continue to maximize the revenue and the revenue growth. For sellers, it's important to have the smooth transition, number one, so that you can be assured that the business is going to continue, something that, again, you spent your life's years growing is going to continue to do well. And at the same time, often it's a situation where the seller is receiving installment payments as part of the buyout. And so it's essential to have a smooth transition to make sure that you're going to maximize the value and receive the full and fair value that you negotiated for. And then for employees and customers, same thing goes as I just mentioned. That is, you want for them to be assured that the business is going to continue on at the same level that it was operating while you were involved. And so continuing will usually keep the employees around. It'll keep customers coming back. And again, sometimes that involves the business owner's involvement after the transition out of the business. So it's not always a quick transition. I use my own situation as a good example. I mentioned that I left private practice, or I've been in my current role, and I'm a former private practice attorney. Well, I was in private practice for almost 13 years before I moved to my current position almost 13 years ago. And when I transitioned out of private practice, I actually sold my business to another law firm. And I continued to assist with that transaction for 2 years. So the transition was one that didn't just immediately take place where, okay, I'm out and all my clients are going to be satisfied meeting with these people who they've never met before. It doesn't work that way. And especially in the service business, it doesn't always work that way. Instead, I had to stay around for a period of time to make sure that my clients were going to be comfortable meeting with the new attorneys whom they didn't have a relationship with. And ultimately to help, again, make sure that there was a smooth transition, which was good for everyone, good for the buyers, good for me, because I felt good about making sure that my clients were taken care of, and good for my employees because they were actually hired by the new company, and good for the customers, the clients, because they had a near seamless experience. So, all right, let's talk about the lifetime exit and the factors that really go into it. And you have to determine first and foremost the timing. And timing is important with a lifetime exit because it really does take at least 2 years to make sure that the company is primed for sale. That is to make sure that the books are put in a position where they're going to maximize the value of the company as the company is sold. I like to even extend that further. I say a minimum of 2 years, but in a perfect world, I would say 5 years. So if you are thinking, yeah, I'd probably want to exit my business in the next 5 years or so, it's time to start planning now and meeting with the attorney and CPA and meeting with Phil to assist with the transition plan now. And that's when you move on to the other factors, which we'll explore in some more detail. But my first question to any business owners: okay, who's the successor going to be? And identifying that successor, we'll talk more about that. Of course, how much of the business is going to be purchased? Is it going to be a majority interest, minority interest? We'll talk about that. The value, that's always the biggest question for most business owners, is not only, okay, when am I going to transition out? Who is going to be the successor? But what's my business worth and how do I value it? How is the purchase price going to be paid? And ultimately, as the business owner, is my involvement going to be necessary to ensure a smooth transition? So first, talking about who the successor is. And the simple situation is usually if there's a business partner, and if there's an age disparity in particular, if you've got a 65-year-old in a business and a 45-year-old, it's a perfect opportunity for that 45-year-old, of course, to be the future successor. I realize it doesn't always work out that way. Frequently, it's two 60-year-olds or two 65-year-olds who are saying, okay, we want to get out in 5 years. And so you have to look to one of the other alternative successors. A family member is another possibility. And when you have family members involved, it's not always necessarily a sale of the business. Frequently, it's going to be part of the estate plan. And it's going to be a gifting strategy to see what can be gifted to the child involved in the business. But if you have kids who are not involved in the business, then we're looking at estate planning techniques, one called estate equalization, to make sure that the kids who are not involved in the business are going to receive fair inheritance. That is something that's close in value to the business that's going to the child who is involved. Then you've got a key employee. If there's a key employee in the business who would be the perfect successor, then something that I frequently hear is, well, yeah, but they don't have the cash to be able to buy the business from me. And that may be true, but there may be alternatives on how a buyout could be structured so that ultimately they could be the opportune successor. And then, of course, an outside third party. And an outside third party could come in a few different flavors, we'll say. One could be a completely unrelated party that is not currently involved in the business in the same geographic area, but may be involved in the same business in another geographic area. Or it could be what I refer to as a friendly competitor who is involved in the same business, not too far away geographically, and would have an interest in taking over an additional business and expanding their footprint in the area. So how much of the business is going to be purchased? And ultimately, it's pretty simple to answer that question. It's either going to be the entire business, a controlling interest, or a non-controlling interest, a minority interest. Every situation is different, but what I see on a frequent basis is where a business owner either wants to sell the entire business or wants to sell a minority interest for now, but with the end goal of selling the controlling interest in the not too distant future. It's really sort of dipping the toe in to say, okay, I'm going to sell the minority interest now, and as long as everything works well and I feel comfortable, then I'll give up more of the interest so that I'm giving up control at that point. And then the other question is it going to be an asset purchase? So just the assets of the business are being sold, or is it going to be a sale of the actual entity? And for the buyer, the question comes down to, do they want to take on the liabilities of the entity itself? Or do they just want to purchase the assets where, again, they don't take on that same liability? And then as part of that question, it always comes down to the goodwill of the company. The company, has it built up a name in the community? Is it worth something to keep that name and to keep that business in existence? It's not always an easy answer. And frankly, it also does enter into the value that they're willing to pay for the business as well. So that's something that usually is negotiated in a lifetime transfer of a business. And of course, from your perspective as a business owner, if you're interested in selling or looking to sell, you're looking to sell the entire business if you can, because of course you would rather sell the liabilities that come along with the business And so that's where the negotiation comes in. And frequently you do have to give some form of discount if you are going to sell the liabilities of the company along with everything else. So talking about value, value is the most frequent question I get when it comes to a business interest. And first of all, I will tell you, if you are going to sell your business, then again, you want to start that process well in advance. And the further in advance that you start that process, the better position the company can be in to maximize the value. And if you're looking to sell during your lifetime, you have one opportunity to get it right. And so in those circumstances, I always recommend a formal valuation be performed. And a formal valuation by a valuation expert is not going to come inexpensively. It's an expensive proposition. It can be, frankly, I see valuations anywhere from $5,000 to tens of thousands, depending on the company that we're looking at. But again, you have one crack at it. You'd rather get it right and do it the right way. There are informal valuations also, and it's what a lot of valuation experts refer to as a calculation of value. It's where they don't do a deep dive into the valuation process, but they sort of look at the surface numbers of the company and then also do a surface look at comp sales and ultimately determine what the value of the business is in terms of a range of values. So the formal valuation is going to better pinpoint an exact value of the company, and informal is going to provide a range that, again, is not the same deep dive. It also doesn't come with the same expense that a formal valuation does. So a lot of valuation firms will provide that calculation of value, and sometimes that's used when you're looking at a family transfer. If there's going to be a transition to the next generation within the family, you might use informal as opposed to formal. But as a general rule, when you're selling the business, formal is always going to be better. And, a common question that I get is, well, okay, so are we just looking at the book value of the company? And the answer is no. Usually what we're looking at is cash flows. And that's because from the buyer's perspective, they're looking at it as, how long is it going to take us to recoup our investment and we start turning a profit? And the time frame that they're looking at most frequently is the 5 years. They want to make sure that they are recouping their investment within 5 years and then are turning to profit after that point. So other methods, informally, and every industry is different, you could look at a multiple of EBITDA, or some business owners will say to me, yeah, so if I take a multiple, my gross revenue. And if you talk to most valuation experts, they're not a huge fan of gross revenue and using a multiple, because that's not a true measure of the profitability of a business. Now, it certainly shows what the level of sales is and what the footprint is of that business. But in most situations, net profit is going to matter a whole lot more than gross profit or gross revenue. So looking at a multiple of net profit, if anything, is going to be a better way to approach it. And still, that gets complicated because, of course, if you're dealing with a flow-through entity like an S Corp or a partnership, then you're trying to minimize the profits that are on those books. So that's where, again, when you start working with valuation experts, they'll do the deep dive to look much further into those numbers to figure out exactly what the value is going to be. So the next question becomes, how is the purchaser going to pay the purchase price? And of course, there's a lump sum. That's always the easiest if somebody can just pay cash for it, but that's certainly not always the case of what they're able or willing to do. And frequently we'll see sales with installments, and those installments are paid, there's an immediate transition of the business interest, but at the same time, installment payments are going to be made to pay out that price. So it could be seller finance. in most circumstances when it's going to be installment payments. The other side is third-party financing and looking at what the credit markets will provide for that purchaser. That is a better approach if you're selling your business, only because you're receiving the full purchase price up front. You don't really care about the loan terms that that buyer is getting. All you care about is that you're getting the purchase price in a lump sum up front. And the only thing that can enter into the equation that sometimes can alter your thoughts on what's going to make the most sense here is taxes. And so oftentimes you may want to elect installment payments. And that way you are actually going to spread out the tax liability over time. And right now is a time where I know a lot of business owners who are exiting out of their businesses are questioning that, because the long-term capital gain rate right now is 20%. And not making any political statements here, just sticking with what has been proposed. And President Biden, as part of his overall tax plan, has indicated that he wants to increase the capital gains rate, the highest capital gains rate, to 39.6% for those earning at least $1 million. So that can have a significant effect, of course, on how the sale of the business is going to be taxed. And it's a common question I'm getting these days is, well, should I be looking at just selling now and paying the full 20% as opposed to electing installments and potentially having to pay 39.6% each and every year, even when I receive those installments? And it's a legitimate question and a difficult one to answer, unfortunately, right now, since there has not officially been a change in the law. All right, so the last aspect is the seller's involvement necessary? And frequently, I use myself as the example, but frequently a business owner will stay on in a consulting agreement, and on the consulting agreement, that could be part of the compensation that ultimately is paid. But there are a lot of different considerations that go in here. First and foremost, are the buyer's jobs responsibilities going to change? Are they going to have to take on more of a management role? And this frequently happens when it's a key employee who's purchasing the business interest. And so in those circumstances, it may be necessary for the seller to stay on for a period of time and consult. And so ultimately, what's going to happen with control and management of the business? And that's a biggie. And it can't be understated. So if you're playing a major role in your company, it's probably a better plan to slowly transition out of that role and turn it over to someone else, as opposed to just doing it cold turkey. It doesn't work too well usually when it is just a sudden complete change of control and management of the company. And then, of course, it's also going to enter in from the buyer's perspective. And again, looking at the potential of a key person, or it may be a family member who has bought you out of the business. Well, are they receiving salary? And if it's installment payments, well, are they taking more salary than they were before the sale? And if so, is that somehow going to adversely affect the income of, or the net revenue of the company, to where potentially they wouldn't be able to make those installment payments? These are all considerations. And then last but not least is, are they asking you to sign a non-compete or a non-solicitation agreement? Frequently, that is going to be part of the negotiation, and they certainly don't want you likely selling the business to them, and then you turn around and say, you know what, I'm going to contact all my customers. I've decided that I'm going to start a competing business. Doesn't usually work out too well that way, and that frequently leads to lawsuits. So if a buyer is handling it the right way, they'll usually want to include some form of non-compete or non-solicitation, or both. All right, so then in terms of a sale, the structure of the sale, frequently what we'll see is when it's not a lump sum buyout, and they're not just paying the full purchase price in that one lump sum, it's going to be installment payments with a more significant down payment first. And there may be a loan involved. And of course, you've got the loan term and interest rate to figure out. That's really not your concern unless it's seller financed. And that's where, again, from your perspective, if you're selling your business, you want the shortest loan term possible, because that's a situation where the longer the business is going to continue, and if you're not involved, then there's a risk there that you're not going to get the full buyout price if something goes wrong with the business and they can't sustain the installment payments. There could be an earnout, and that is, if there's a guaranteed portion of the buyout price, and then an earnout on top of that, that is, you stay involved, and as long as that transition is successful, then you are earning based on certain benchmarks that are reached with retention of the business. Or I've seen situations where, frankly, a business owner stays on as an employee. They sell the business to the other employees. Usually it's the younger employees who are stepping up into leadership roles, selling the business to them, staying on as an employee and taking salary. And that may be part of the buyout as well. Again, it's all in a negotiation.
Brian, we have a question here that kind of dovetails with what you were just sharing. And that is, imagine, if you will, that there is actually this large increase in the capital gains rate that you were discussing. The question is, in that scenario, are there other ways of selling a business, other methods that you could utilize that would become more attractive rather than just a straight sale? And the example that is listed is maybe an ESOP or something along those lines.
So in every situation, it's a great question, and every great question is difficult to answer. And it's difficult to answer because every situation is different. It absolutely can make sense to explore other things like an ESOP. That absolutely can make sense. But in addition, I think part of the reason that you want to start that planning process 2 to 5 years before actually ever selling the company is so that you can position the company in, again, the best light to sell, number one. Number two, as part of that is to minimize taxes and determine, based on the books, what is going to be the most effective way to sell this business so that we can minimize taxes. And taxes are always at the forefront of every sale. And I said before, there was no specific order to that list that I went through of common objectives, but you'll notice the taxes were listed first, and that's because that's usually what's on a business owner's mind. One way that frankly, you could minimize some of the taxes is to minimize the income as well, and to minimize the gain that's being recognized each and every year. And that's going to depend on the sale price of the business. But if you're able to minimize income to under $1 million, then it's possible that you're not going to jump into that highest rate, that highest 39.6% rate. And I also just have to point out that the 39.6% is not the law right now, but that's why it's so important to start working with the planning professionals, the mergers and acquisitions attorney, along with CPAs, to start really analyzing the books and reposition them in a way where it's going to maximize the value and at the same time minimize the taxes. So I know that's sort of a generic answer, but unfortunately, again, it's such a good question. It's a tough one to answer, but it is very subjective. All right. So,
and in truth, Brian, the reality is that the specific answer is going to be dependent upon the unique characteristics of the individual situation. And so, when we get to the end of the presentation, maybe we can talk a little bit around the next steps that a business owner could take if they want to explore, okay, this is great content that you're delivering, but for my specific circumstances, what's the best fit for me? So we'll talk about that at the end.
Absolutely. All right, so let's transition to the unplanned exit, what is referred to here as the emergency exit. And when I talk to business owners, priority is usually on the family. That is, they're saying, okay, if something happens to me, I want to make sure that my family is taken care of and that they're going to get the full buyout price and that there aren't going to be any issues for them. So that's the importance of setting up an emergency exit plan, which is really prearranging all of the terms of a sale and purchase so that there is nothing that's left in negotiation. And if there are other owners of the business, then keeping the business in control of the owners, while at the same time not putting the family in a position where they have to suddenly jump into a business where they don't have familiarity, they haven't been running it, they haven't been operating it, and all of a sudden they've got to figure out how to operate the business and exactly what to do. And in the end, to provide assurances not just for the family, but in addition to provide assurances for the employees, the customers, and the creditors of the business. They're all, again, important stakeholders in the business, and especially the employees should be consulted, and at least they should know that there's a plan in place should something happen to the primary business owner or owners. So here, again, same as with the planned exit, step one is always determining who the successor is going to be. Then it's the value of the business interest being purchased, and it's going to be a little bit different, as you'll see on the unplanned exit side. How the purchaser is going to pay that purchase price, and ultimately, is there additional risk? If you are suddenly removed from the business unexpectedly, is there additional risk to the company that could lead to reduced sales or just difficulty in managing the company in the short term? All right, so let's first tackle who the successor is. Again, you'll see this list looks pretty familiar, but it's just a little bit of a twist, and that is if there are other business owners, then usually with the unplanned exit, the agreement, a buy-sell agreement, is going to provide for the surviving owners to buy out a deceased owner's interest or a disabled owner's interest. It would require for them to buy out no matter what. Doesn't matter if you've got the 65-year-old and 45-year-old or two 65-year-olds, it's the business partner who has that obligation. If it's a family member, it's very, very different with an unplanned exit, because specifically if we're talking about a death situation, then the question is, all right, are we going to deal with this and require a sale through a buy-sell agreement, or is there going to be a transition of the business through the estate plan, through a trust or will? And then how are we going to make sure that the business ends up in the right hands? Again, talking about the family where there's one child involved in the business and two who aren't involved. Well, how are we going to get the business in the hands of the child who is involved in the business versus what's going to pass to those who are not involved? I talk to business owners a lot, and when they're in a position where they've got that one child involved in the business and two who aren't, and their immediate thought is, I'm just going to leave the business to all three kids and I'm going to let them figure it out. I always recommend against that strategy, because the kids always get along until they don't. And it's always a tenuous situation when you have one child who's involved in the business, has been involved in decision making, and all of a sudden their two siblings now are business partners, and their two siblings actually together have a controlling interest over that child who is involved in the business. And that's what can lead to some discord within the family. And when there are other ways to plan around it, that is certainly, in my opinion, a better way to go. But again, as we've talked about, every situation is different, and it just depends on the specific circumstances.
So Brian, that kind of hits on a question that's related to that. And that question from one of the participants in this webinar was, in a family-owned business, how do you determine the best person to take a leadership role when there are two or more family members or owners who both or each want the job and feel that they're the best qualified?
So it's a good question, and that's where you need the psychologist involved too. But no, I think what it comes down to is each child may believe that they're best equipped to be able to manage the business, but what does the business owner believe? So you certainly don't want for that family discord to enter into the equation. Sometimes it is a question of looking at each child's strengths, and they can be in charge of different parts of the business. That does take some very careful discussion and some very careful negotiation to an extent as well, because you're not only dealing with employees within the business or potential future owners of the business, you're dealing with family relationships. And you've probably seen some of the movies and TV shows where there are all these problems within the family and the disagreements that they have on who should be running it. What's the show that was on HBO, Succession? That's a good example where there are differing opinions, and again, family relationships can be affected. So I think, again, every situation is different. What could be really helpful in those situations is to bring in the professionals as well, to have family meetings with the planning professionals and have a plan ahead of time to, really a plan of attack to know exactly what the end goal is. But, I think it's important for a family, especially the patriarch who is running the business, not to try to do it on their own. Bring in the planning professionals and let them assist, because they're used to dealing with these circumstances.
I was just going to say, Brian, I think that's a really good piece of advice, to bring in the outside professionals who are a little bit arm's length, and maybe it's not as much personal in that. But I also think there's a lot of benefit in being proactive and starting those kinds of decisions and discussions about those decisions further in advance, working through it, and perhaps giving those 2, 3, 4 different family members who see them in that light, give them an opportunity to assume some leadership responsibilities. And maybe it is a division of labor, as you described, or maybe it is, hey, we've been working through this for the last few years, and it's possible that maybe one really does differentiate themselves from the others, as maybe the enterprise leader, where there's still a role, obviously, for the other. But I think effective communication and starting sooner, if you just let that kind of fester under the surface and don't address it until the transition actually occurs, I think that's where you're more likely to have greater tension.
No doubt about it. Another good question, by the way. All right, so let's talk about the key employee then as a potential successor. Frequent response I hear is, all right, well, I have a key employee who would be a good successor. He or she could certainly step in and run the business, but they would never be able to buy me out. They'd never have the funds for that. And again, that's a secondary issue. You're looking for, number one, who would successfully be able to operate the business, and then talk about the other alternatives as far as ownership goes and how the purchase price might be paid. But key employee is frequently a good option. And then here, an outside third party again, and frequently it's going to be, and when we're looking at outside third parties, friendly competitors. And I had a situation a couple of years ago where there was a dentist who owned a practice, and he was a solo practitioner, didn't have any other younger dentists in with him, didn't have any plans of adding any. And he was saying, I don't know what's going to happen with my business once something happens to me. And I asked him, do you have any friendly friends who are dentists also? And he said, yeah, I do. I've got a lot, actually. I said, okay, any of them geographically close to you? He said, well, yeah, there's one who is about 5 miles away. I said, does he have a successor? And he said, no, he doesn't. Same situation I'm in. And so they ended up entering into a buy-sell agreement that obligated each other to buy out the other's interest in the event that something happened to them. So entering into that agreement to buy out each other's practice, they trusted each other. They trusted the way that they ran their practices. So that's just an example of how you can use the benefit of a friendly competitor and, again, someone you trust to be able to transition the business. All right, so then we talk about value of the business, and it's a little more difficult in the unplanned exit world because we don't know when the transition is going to occur. I am a big fan of building into a buy-sell agreement, and a buy-sell agreement, which I have defined later, but I'll just give the definition now. The buy-sell agreement is a written agreement that determines what happens with the business in the event of one of those triggering events that I mentioned earlier: death, disability, involuntarily leaving the business, or disagreement, whatever the case may be. And again, the challenge is we don't know what triggering event would require a sale, number one, what actually might be triggered. And number two, we don't know what the value of the business is going to be at that time. So I'm a big fan in a buy-sell agreement of providing for what's called a certificate of agreed value. That is, each year, the owners of the company in an annual meeting set the price for each share of the business, whether it's stock or membership interest, determine what the value is for the next 12 months. And if there are any of those triggering events that are indeed triggered, then that's the value for a buyout in the following 12 months. If there is no price that has been determined, no agreed value in the last 12 months, then it would have to fall back on another formula. Frequently, that is bringing in valuation experts at that point. Sometimes buy-sell agreements do base it on cash flows or other formulas that are built in, completely based on the specific industry and what's accepted within the industry of your business. But again, getting together for that certificate of agreed value can make sure that the value is keeping up with the true value of the business and what is going on with the business. And hopefully the business is growing in value. I review too many situations where a buy-sell agreement has been drafted and there's a set value in the agreement. And it's been 10 years since they've updated the agreement. And the value that was built in was $750,000, but now they believe that the business is worth more like $3 million. So my strong suggestion is never build in a specific amount in the buy-sell agreement. If anything, provide for a formula, or better yet, agree on a different value every 12 months and then fall back to one of the other formulas if necessary. When it comes to formal valuation versus informal valuation for a buy-sell, I don't suggest having a formal valuation performed because we don't know when that buyout is actually going to occur. So to have a formal valuation and spend the thousands of dollars, it just seems a little excessive at this point in time. And looking at an informal valuation, I think that's okay depending on what the cost is. And again, that's that calculation of value that a lot of valuation experts will perform. And that will at least give a good range of what the value is today. And then you can almost back into a formula depending on, again, the industry that you're in. And that could be built into the buy-sell agreement. But again, it's always going to come back to those same elements of future cash flows. And if you're looking specifically to a third party who might be obligated to buy out the business interest, that's what they're looking at is, okay, what is the net profit of this business going to be? And when am I going to recoup my investment? So really the same elements enter into it. It's just applied differently because we don't know when the sale is actually going to occur. Now, then the question is, how will the purchaser pay that purchase price? And built into the buy-sell agreement frequently is, for a death scenario, the requirement for life insurance to be in place. That usually is preferred because life insurance policy is going to, of course, have life insurance premiums that are leveraged into the death benefit. So the life insurance policy would pay the death benefit when it's needed, and otherwise you're paying money toward premiums. Same goes for what's called disability buyout insurance. That is, if there's a permanent disability, then this insurance will pay a lump sum to fund the buyout. I have talked to many business owners in the past who have explored both of these costs, and they end up usually pursuing the life insurance, and they frequently don't pursue the disability buyout insurance because it tends to be more expensive than life insurance. And when they're looking at the cost of both, they're saying, yeah, planning for a death scenario is more important to us and something we think is more important to plan for. So regardless, they are both available. Otherwise, what is usually built into a buy-sell agreement as the default formula is going to be installment payments. And it's usually going to be in no longer than 5 years. So installments are paid for 5 years to fully fund that buyout price. Usually there's going to be some interest that's built into it as well. There is some risk involved, and that is that if the business suffers in any way financially, will the purchaser or will the company be able to support those installment payments going forward? That's the one risk that I always have a concern about in those circumstances. There's also third-party financing. I don't like this one at all. When there's a default formula, I always like to rely on installment payments in a buy-sell agreement. With the third-party financing, if you're requiring a buyer to go out and get a loan, I always go back to 2008, 2009, when credit markets really shrank, and it wasn't so easy to get a loan back then. And if someone passes away and the buyers are required to go out and get a loan, well, if the credit markets aren't good, what is their likelihood of getting that loan? And then how are they going to pay the purchase price if they can't? So a lot of risk involved in that one. The last option for a buy-sell agreement is relying on a sinking fund. This is where literally the business is going to take money out of the operating cash flow and put it into a side fund. A lot of business owners don't like this form of funding the buy-sell arrangement, only because you're using dollar for dollar to do it. And many times when it's a flow-through entity, you've already paid taxes on that money, and it's instead money that just has to sit there. And on top of that, it's frequent for businesses when there's a cash need. Well, where do you go first to obtain the cash? Probably the sinking fund. So I don't successfully see these arrangements actually carried out. So again, installment payments and a lump sum through the insurance, those are the two preferred methods without a doubt. So I mentioned that a buy-sell agreement is a binding written agreement that governs what happens upon one of those triggering events that I mentioned earlier. I want to mention one additional item on this, and that is that when we're talking about a buy-sell agreement, it should be drafted by an attorney. That is a must. I have seen agreements before, review them, where I'm reading them thinking, this doesn't fit the situation at all. And in the end, we determined that it was a form from the internet. Don't do that. You want it drafted by an agreement, by an attorney who knows what they're doing. And it should always be funded in some way, whether it's insurance or providing for installments, and making sure that the installments can support those payments is incredibly important. And the last thing I want to talk about, last point here, I know we're getting short on time, is other issues. Is your removal from the company going to cause some difficulty for the company? And here, of course, we've got the employee looking at himself as employee of the month, but that's not out of the ordinary for the owner to be the most important part of the business. And it's a key person. And I liken key person to the game of Jenga, the tower of blocks. When you pull out a block and it would collapse, that's your key person. What can make a business owner key is the fact that you've got these special contacts or connections. You've got a unique sales ability or responsible for significant sales. Expertise, whether it's in the financial area, product and design, leadership skills. Sometimes it's just that natural leadership ability to be able to run the company. But if you're thinking that if your removal from the company, if something, God forbid, happened to you and the company would have a difficult time continuing at the same high level, then you're a key person. And that is where key person life insurance enters into the equation. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. Usually it's term insurance. And with the term insurance, it's owned by the company. The company is the beneficiary. God forbid something happens to you, that death benefit pays out to the company. And then the company has funds to do whatever it needs to do to get by in the short term until it can get up to speed and, again, reach that same level of success, hopefully. Last thing I'll mention is retaining key employees. This is a biggie. If there are employees who would be essential to the continuation of the business, there are things called stay bonuses, retention bonuses. That is, as long as the employee sticks around for a period of time, if God forbid something happens to the owner or owners, then they receive a large cash bonus. Very simple strategy and a good way to make sure that they would stick around if, again, something happened to a key employee. So I'm going to end with just a couple of comments. One is your next step in the planning process is always to develop a planned exit, especially if you're 2 to 5 years out. It's essential to start that planning process now. In addition, to have an unplanned exit strategy in place, have a buy-sell agreement in place, an updated buy-sell agreement in place, have it fully funded. And in the event that there is additional risk involved, again, analyze those risks. Once you have the plan in place, then it's just maintaining the plan. But it's essential to have that plan in place to start. And something that we do have the ability to offer is we have what's called a business succession evaluation process. That is where I have the ability to really review the succession plan that you have in place, reviewing a buy-sell agreement, and this is on the unplanned exit side, reviewing your buy-sell agreement and making sure that it includes all the terms that it should include, number one, and number two, make sure the funding is appropriate based on your specific business. And again, just helping you to make sure that everything is in place as you would want for it to be. And because of your relationship with Brand, there is no cost to you for this analysis. So again, something that we do offer and I think could be very beneficial, again, if you don't have a succession plan in place or it's been a while since it's been reviewed. So I know I talked very fast there at the end, sorry, but again, I do want to be respectful of everyone's time.
Ryan, thank you so very, very much. We do have a couple of additional questions. One goes back to that tax element, specifically that step up in cost basis that we currently enjoy. If that gets limited or goes away, might that mean that large private businesses are forced to buy significant insurance, or that such companies start breaking up into smaller pieces sooner, seeming like that could crush the benefit of being an owner of a significantly large and growing small company?
Yeah, great question. And first of all, that's exactly why I don't think it'll pass. And if you really do some research on all the comments that have come from this, there doesn't seem to be support in the Senate for it for that exact reason. And recently, it was reported that there are 13 Democratic House representatives who said, look, we're not on board because of the way that this would affect our business owner clients and our farmer clients in particular. So that's exactly why I think it wouldn't happen. But if for some reason it did, I think my answer would be yes and yes. I think you would look to other strategies. I think you would look to maybe break up the business into separate entities that could each perform differently. I think you would look to life insurance playing a role, much like it does with estate tax funding right now. It would also provide capital gains tax funding if necessary. So I think there would be a lot of different options, and that is, there would be discounting potentially that would be available too. So trying to minimize the value of the entity. There are a lot of different approaches that could happen, and what I urge business owners not to do now is panic. Don't panic, until we actually see a law that is passed and in place. And even when one is, if it happened to be that drastic, there will be planning opportunities to help minimize the impact of the taxes. So there are a lot of creative people in the estate and business planning world, and there are a lot of creative techniques that are available right now. And there would be even more creative techniques available if there was that type of change in the tax law.
Yeah, I completely concur with you, Brian. One thing that we've seen is, tax law or estate law changes all the time. And every time it changes, the strategies and tactics you deploy as a byproduct of those new laws need to be evaluated, modified, and the strategies shift in response to that. And this is an example where you could see some different approaches. We did have another question that was really, it's a difficult question to answer. It was, what is the best time to sell your business? And, I'll take a shot at that and then let you come alongside of it, Brian. I think the best time to sell a business is hard to predict. And so one of the things that allows you to maximize the value of a business transaction is doing the things that Brian's talked about today, which is planning in advance and beginning to look at it. What we find in talking to folks like Brian or talking to M&A experts, mergers and acquisitions experts, is that oftentimes somebody comes to the party really, really late and says, I've decided I want to exit my business. Can you get it sold for me? And they could have realized so much more value, or perhaps have capitalized on a different valuation season had they been planning that for several years in advance. So the other thing that I would share is it's not uncommon for the valuations of businesses to ebb and flow depending upon where we are in the economic cycle or how that particular industry is performing. Sometimes you see a surge in acquisitions in a particular sector for one reason or another, and businesses in that sector end up having higher valuations as a byproduct. Well, if you've been planning for an eventual exit, you're not really sure when, and you see one of those waves coming, you might be better positioned to capitalize on it and to catch that crest than if you're late to the party, you haven't taken some of the steps that Brian's described or others. So it's a little bit beyond the scope of this conversation, but I wanted to at least honor the question by giving a high-level answer. I think we at Brand may have another webinar targeted at business owner clients that really is focused on how do you consider when I want to exit the business and what steps might I take in order to enhance the likelihood that I realize the value that I built in my business. So maybe more coming on that somewhere down the road. I don't have any other questions coming in right now. Again, I think Brian pointed out we're at the end of our allotted time for today. So we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. Brian, I have to thank you for your expertise and for your time this morning, sharing the wisdom you have around the area of succession planning. The key takeaways that I wrote down is, you need to be prepared for both an unexpected exit as well as the expected. And what we commonly see is that people think about their expected exit typically later than maybe they should have, but they start thinking about that. And there's a risk to the business and a risk to the value of the business and to the family who owns the business by not planning. And so our encouragement would be, go ahead and do some planning well in advance. This business succession evaluation form that Brian alluded to is a great tool. If you haven't looked at your succession plan recently, or if you don't have one in place, reach out to our firm. We'd be happy to facilitate a connection to Brian so he can go through that exercise with you, and we'd walk alongside you in determining what do you want to put in place to address those two eventualities. It is, as is the case with so many other things in life, things that get attention have better results. And whether that is reviewing your estate plans periodically to ensure that they still make sense, or whether it is reviewing your succession plan for your business, we definitely encourage you taking a look at these things, spending some time thinking about them, and ensuring that you've got a good solution in place. And if, for example, planning for an unexpected exit, it never happens, thank God it never needed to be put in place. But if it does happen and it hasn't been planned for, that can be a real problem for the business, for its continuity, and for your family. So, Brian, any last comments?
I think you covered it. I just want to thank you for having me, and thanks for everyone who listened in and watched in. Greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely. I concur, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Have a great rest of your day.